gave you a lawful order, medic. Step away from the individual.
And I am following my lawful duty to save a life. You are interfering.
That's your final warning.
The first call of the day cracked through the radio speaker at 9:14 a.m., a burst of controlled urgency slicing through the quiet lull of the station. The scent of fresh coffee and sterile cleaning supplies still hung in the air of Station 4, a familiar morning ritual. Medic 14, respond to a medical emergency at Liberty Park South Entrance. Adult male, unresponsive. Imani Cole was already moving, her hand reaching for the tablet to get the updated notes from dispatch before the last word had finished echoing. Medic 14 responding, she said, her voice a calm, resonant instrument perfected over 7 years of navigating chaos. At 31, her movements were efficient, economical, free of any wasted energy. Every motion had a purpose. Her partner David Chen, a lanky, good-natured man whose perpetual calm was a perfect counterbalance to her focused intensity, was already in the driver's seat, the ambulance's powerful diesel engine rumbling to life. The siren's first piercing wail cut through the bright morning air as they pulled out of the bay, the force of the acceleration a familiar pressure against her back. This was their office. Not the quiet station, but the roaring, lurching cabin of the rig, a self-contained world of life-saving potential hurtling through the streets of the city. The sun, already high and bright, glinted off the windshield, promising another sweltering day. Liberty Park, David confirmed, his eyes scanning the traffic ahead. Dispatch notes say a bystander saw him collapse near the fountain, no other details. Imani's mind was already a library of possibilities, flipping through pages of protocol. Unresponsive male, public space, morning. Could be anything. A diabetic emergency, a stroke, overdose, or the big one, cardiac arrest. The location was the first problem. A park meant grass, uneven ground, and crowds. Every variable had to be accounted for. She pulled on a pair of nitrile gloves, the snap against her wrists a familiar grounding ritual. It was a small action that signaled the transition from Imani the person to Cole the paramedic. She was born and raised in this city, a place of sprawling suburbs and a dense, complicated urban heart. She had become a paramedic not out of a vague desire to help people, but out of a specific driving need to impose order on chaos, to be the steady hand in the storm. It was a calling that demanded perfection. In her world, a 99% success rate was a failure. That 1% was a life, a family shattered. As they neared the park, David expertly navigated the ambulance over the curb and onto a paved pathway, parting a sea of joggers and dog walkers. Ahead they could see it. A small cluster of people gathered near the large, ornate fountain at the park's center. A single police cruiser was already on the scene, its lights flashing silently. Response time is 6 minutes, Imani noted, more to herself than to David. Good. But in the world of an oxygen-starved brain, 6 minutes was an eternity. She was out of the passenger door before the rig had fully settled, grabbing the jump bag and the cardiac monitor. The jump bag was a 50-pound extension of her own will, a portable emergency room containing everything needed for the first, most critical moments of advanced life support. "David, get the stretcher and the airway bag," she called over her shoulder, her eyes already locked on the scene, assessing, analyzing. The bystander who had called 911, a young woman in running gear, pointed frantically. He was walking and he just fell. He's not breathing right." In the center of the circle lay a man, likely in his early 60s, sprawled on his side on the grass. His face was a terrifying shade of dusky gray, his lips blue. A faint, gurgling sound escaped his throat with each strained, ineffective breath. Agonal breathing. The last gasp of a dying brain. This was it. The big one! Imani dropped to her knees beside him, her world instantly shrinking to the few square feet of grass that held this single human life. The murmurs of the crowd, the distant city traffic, the warmth of the sun, it all faded into a dull, irrelevant hum. Her fingers went to his carotid artery, pressing into the soft tissue of his neck. She searched for the telltale beat. Nothing. Not a flicker. "He's in arrest," she announced, her voice projecting calm authority. "David, I need the Lucas device, now!" The Lucas was a mechanical CPR machine, a tireless piston that could deliver perfect chest compressions indefinitely. She ripped open the man's polo shirt with a pair of trauma shears, exposing his chest. As she positioned her hands to begin manual compressions, a shadow fell over her. "Hold on a minute." The voice was sharp, laced with an impatience that felt jarringly out of place. "This is my scene. You don't do anything until I say so." Imani didn't look up. Her patient didn't have a minute. He didn't have 10 seconds. Her focus was absolute. "I'm a paramedic," she said, her hands finding the correct position on the man's sternum. "This man is in cardiac arrest. I need to start compressions." "I gave you an order, medic. Stop what you're doing." This time she risked a glance up. A police officer stood over her, his boots planted firmly on the grass. He was young, late 20s, maybe 30, with a tightly squared jaw and mirrored sunglasses that hid his eyes, creating an impassive, unreadable mask. The nameplate on his uniform read, K. Jennings. His hand was resting on the grip of his holstered sidearm, a pose of casual, practiced dominance. His entire presence radiated an aggressive, territorial energy that set every one of her internal alarms screaming. This wasn't an officer arriving to help. This was an officer arriving to take control, and in that moment, he had decided that she was the first thing he needed to bring to heel. "Officer, I have a man here who is clinically dead," Imani said, her tone deliberately even and professional. She refused to be drawn into an emotional confrontation. Her patient's life depended on her remaining the calmest person at the scene. "Every second I delay, his chances of survival drop by 10%. I need to work. Now!" She pressed down hard, beginning the first chest compression. The man's ribs groaned under the force, a grim but necessary sound. 1, 2, 3, 4. Officer Jennings took a step closer, his shadow completely eclipsing her and the patient. His posture stiffened, a physical manifestation of his bruised authority. "I am securing the scene. That means everything stops until I get a handle on the situation. You don't seem to understand that. You will stop what you are doing and you will speak to me." Imani's mind reeled. Securing the scene? From what? She glanced around. A peaceful park on a Tuesday morning. A handful of concerned citizens, a man whose heart had stopped. There was no evidence of a crime, no sign of a struggle. "With all due respect, officer, what situation are you trying to get a handle on? This is a medical emergency. A man collapsed. It's a 911 call, not a crime scene." "That's for me to determine, not you," Jennings snapped, his voice sharp with irritation. It was the tone of a man unaccustomed to being questioned. "When I arrive, the scene belongs to me. That's the law. Your job is to follow my instructions. It's that simple." David arrived with the stretcher and the Lucas device, his eyes wide as he took in the insane standoff. He hesitated, looking from Imani's determined face to the unyielding officer. The tension was a palpable, crackling thing in the air. "Imani," David started, his voice uncertain. "Set up the Lucas," she ordered, her voice leaving no room for argument. She continued her compressions, her arms burning with the effort, her focus locked on the rhythm. 21, 22, 23. Jennings seemed to swell with indignation. The idea that a paramedic, a female paramedic, would so flagrantly disregard his direct order in front of a crowd was clearly an intolerable affront. This was no longer about procedure for him. It had become personal. It was about dominance. "Did you not hear me? I gave you a lawful order," he said, his voice low and menacing. He had shifted his stance, planting his feet in a way that subtly blocked David from easily reaching the patient. "And I am following my legal and ethical duty as a licensed paramedic to provide life-saving care," Imani retorted, her breath coming in short, controlled bursts as she worked. "State law protects my right and responsibility to treat a critical patient. Interfering with that treatment is a felony. Now, you can either help us by keeping the crowd back, or you can step aside and let us do our jobs." The silence that followed was heavy and dangerous. Imani was vaguely aware of the onlookers, their phones now emerging from their pockets, a periphery of witnesses to this surreal power struggle. The only sounds were her own counting, the distant traffic, and the officer's heavy, angry breathing. "I need to see your identification," Jennings said, shifting tactics. If he couldn't intimidate her into stopping, he would bog her down in bureaucratic nonsense. He was pulling at threads, looking for any avenue to reassert his control. "My identification is in the ambulance," Imani said, never breaking rhythm. She had reached 100 compressions and immediately began another cycle. "My partner can get it for you, or you can verify my credentials through your dispatch. But I am not stopping chest compressions on a dying man to show you my driver's license." "So you're refusing to identify yourself?" he pressed, framing her medical priority as an act of defiance. "I'm refusing to abandon my patient," Imani corrected him, her voice sharp with a frustration she could no longer completely hide. "There's a difference." She saw David finally get the Lucas device positioned. It was a critical, coordinated movement. He needed to place the suction cup on the patient's chest, and she needed to time her compressions to allow him to do it. "David, on my count," she said. "Ready? 1, 2. But as she prepared to pause for the briefest of seconds, Officer Jennings moved. He didn't grab her, not yet. He stepped directly into the small space between her and David, his body a physical barrier. His presence was a solid blue wall of obstruction. "You are obstructing my investigation," he said, his voice flat and final. "You," Imani shot back, her own patience, a deep and usually unshakable well finally running dry, "are obstructing a resuscitation. This man is my only priority. Now get out of my way!" For a heartbeat, they were locked in a stalemate. A paramedic on her knees, hands slick with sweat, trying to force life back into a body. A police officer on his feet, arms crossed, the symbol of the law becoming an obstacle to life itself. The beautiful sunny morning in the park had become the backdrop for an ugly, dangerous clash of wills. And the clock was ticking, not just on the scene, but inside a man's chest. The patient on the ground let out a soft, rattling sigh, a final exhalation of air. His skin, already ashen, seemed to take on a deeper, more translucent gray. On the monitor that David had managed to attach, the flat line that indicated asystole, the complete absence of electrical activity in the heart, remained cruelly unchanged. He wasn't just dying, he was gone. But there was still a window, a slim, rapidly closing chance to bring him back before his brain was irreversibly damaged. "He's been down too long," David said, his voice strained with anxiety. "Imani, we need to shock him if we get a rhythm. We need to get the Lucas running." "I know," Imani said, her arms screaming in protest as she continued the relentless compressions. She could feel the officer's eyes on her, a palpable weight of resentment. "What part of stop do you not understand?" Officer Jennings said, his voice rising. He was losing control of the situation, and it was making him reckless. His audience of bystanders was growing, their murmurs turning from concern for the patient to disbelief at the officer's actions. "Let her do her job," a man in the crowd shouted. "For God's sake, are you crazy?" Jennings's head snapped toward the voice. "You stay out of this or you'll be next," he yelled, pointing an accusatory finger. The threat was petulant, the reaction of a bully whose authority was being challenged from all sides. That brief diversion was the only opening Imani needed. She saw her chance. "David, now!" While Jennings's attention was split, David lunged forward, finally locking the Lucas device into place over the patient's chest. The machine whirred to life with a loud thump, 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 taking over the job of chest compressions with perfect mechanical efficiency. It was a huge step, freeing Imani's hands to manage the more complex aspects of the resuscitation. She immediately reached for the defibrillator paddles, preparing to charge them. But as she moved, Jennings refocused on her. His face, which she could now see clearly as he leaned down, was flushed with anger. The veins in his neck stood out. "That's it. You're done," he growled, his voice low and guttural. He had been pushed past his limit. His ego had suffered a public blow, and he was going to reassert his dominance in the most dramatic way possible. He reached for her. His hand clamped down on her upper arm, his grip like a vice. The sudden, shocking violation sent a jolt through her. It wasn't just a touch. It was an assertion of ownership, a physical declaration that she belonged to him now. "I told you to stop," he snarled, his face inches from hers. The smell of his cheap, musky cologne was suffocating. "You don't get to decide what happens here. I do." The world seemed to warp and slow down. The feel of his fingers digging into her biceps, the sight of the Lucas machine methodically pressing on her patient's chest, the sound of David's sharp intake of breath. This was the point of no return. The line had been crossed. This was no longer a jurisdictional squabble. This was a physical assault on a medical professional during a resuscitation. It was an act of such profound irresponsibility that her mind could barely process it. She looked from his hand on her arm up to his mirrored sunglasses, which reflected a distorted, wide-eyed image of her own face. Her expression was a mask of cold fury. "Take your hand off of me, officer," Imani said, her voice dangerously quiet, each word precise and sharp. "You are actively interfering with a resuscitation. You are costing this man his life." "You're under arrest," Jennings declared, the words booming with a sense of triumphant finality. He seemed to relish the statement, the ultimate trump card that proved his authority was absolute. The declaration was so absurd, so completely divorced from the reality of the situation, that for a moment, Imani could only stare at him in stunned silence. Arrested? For what? For refusing to let a man die? For upholding the very oath she had sworn? The crowd gasped audibly. David froze, half crouched over the patient, his face a canvas of pure disbelief. "Arrested for what?" Imani demanded, wrenching her arm from his grasp with a sharp, decisive movement. She refused to be manhandled. She immediately turned back to her patient, grabbing the defibrillator paddles. "David, we are shocking on the next rhythm check." She was done talking. She was done negotiating with this man's fragile ego. A life was on the line, and she would not let him be the reason it was lost. Her oath was to her patient, not to the uniformed bully standing over her. And she had made her choice. But as Imani placed the defibrillator paddles on the patient's chest, ready to analyze his heart rhythm, Jennings acted. He grabbed her again, not by the arm this time, but by the shoulder of her uniform, and violently yanked her backward. The force was stunning. She stumbled, her feet tangling, and lost her balance. Her medical kit, which had been open on the grass beside her, tipped over, its meticulously organized contents spilling across the damp earth. Syringes, airway adjuncts, medication vials, the tools of her trade scattered like discarded toys in the dirt. "You're under arrest for obstruction of justice and resisting a law enforcement officer," Jennings shouted, his voice ringing with a righteous fury that he had clearly manufactured to justify his actions. He was the hero, she was the villain. In his mind, the narrative was set. He spun her around with surprising strength, wrenching her arms behind her back in a painful, awkward position. The cold, unforgiving steel of handcuffs closed around her wrists. The sharp click, click, click as the ratchet tightened was the loudest sound Imani had ever heard. It was a sound of absolute finality, a sound of utter insanity. It was the sound of a world turned upside down, where a paramedic fighting to save a life was treated like a common felon. The bite of the metal into her skin was a sharp, grounding pain in the midst of the surreal chaos. "My patient!" Imani cried out, her professional composure finally shattering. Her voice was raw with desperation as she twisted her head to look back at the scene. The image would be seared into her memory forever. The man on the ground, the Lucas machine still pumping away, and David, looking on, paralyzed by shock and a dawning horror. "David, don't stop! You have to keep working him! Call a supervisor!" Her plea seemed to snap David out of his trance. He immediately dropped back to the patient's side. His hands, though visibly shaking with adrenaline and rage, moved with purpose, checking the monitor, preparing the next intervention. He was alone now, one paramedic trying to do the work of two, his partner being dragged away in handcuffs. The scene erupted. The crowd of onlookers who had been hesitant witnesses transformed into an angry mob. They surged forward, a wall of civilian outrage. Their phones were held high, a forest of lenses recording every second of the travesty. "What are you doing to her? She was helping him!" "You're a monster! You're letting him die!" "We're filming this! Everyone's seeing this, you bastard!" Jennings seemed momentarily taken aback by the crowd's venom, but his jaw hardened. He shoved Imani forward toward his patrol car, his hand firmly planted in the middle of her back. "Get back! All of you, get back now!" he roared, his authority now dependent on the volume of his voice and the weapon on his hip. As he forced her away from the scene, Imani's eyes remained locked on her patient. She saw David working desperately, a lone first responder in a sea of chaos. She saw the man's color, if possible, worsening. She knew with a sickening certainty that this delay, this insane, pointless, ego-driven interruption, was costing the man precious brain cells, precious heart muscle, precious life. Every second that ticked by while she was being marched to a police car in shame was a second his chances of a meaningful recovery dwindled to zero. The door of the patrol car was hot to the touch. Jennings pulled it open and pushed her unceremoniously into the back seat. The door slammed shut with a deafening thud, sealing her in a cage of hard plastic and reinforced glass. Through the metal grate separating the front and back seats, she watched the scene play out like a silent, horrific movie. She saw David on his radio, his mouth moving frantically, no doubt calling for another unit, for a supervisor, for anyone who could fix this nightmare. She saw the construction workers surrounding him, some trying to help, creating a protective circle around the patient. Their bodies a defiant barrier against the officer who had betrayed his duty to protect and serve. She was a paramedic, a healer, and she was sitting in handcuffs in the back of a police car, watching a man die. The person who had put her there wasn't a criminal or an assailant. He wore a badge. He was supposed to be her partner in these moments of life and death. He hadn't just arrested her. He had abandoned his most fundamental duty. In that moment, sitting in the suffocating heat of the car, a cold, clear resolution formed in the pit of her stomach. This would not stand. Officer Cade Jennings had just made the biggest mistake of his career. He just didn't know it yet. He thought he had won a contest of wills. What he had actually done was ignite a fire that would consume him. The back of the patrol car was an oven. The vinyl seat was sticky against Imani's uniform, and the handcuffs, cinched brutally tight behind her back, dug into her wrists with every slight movement. The air was thick with the sterile smell of plastic and the faint, acrid scent of old fear. Through the metal partition, she watched Officer Jennings. He stood beside his driver's side door, speaking into the radio microphone clipped to his shoulder. His back was to her, but his posture was rigid, defensive. He was crafting his narrative, turning her life-saving actions into a story of obstruction, her professional urgency into a tale of non-compliance. He was building his legal fortress, brick by brick, lie by lie. Imani pressed her face against the hot window, her gaze fixed on the scene she'd been torn from. She saw David, his face a mask of desperation, attach a breathing bag to the patient's airway and begin manually squeezing air into his lungs. The tireless Lucas machine continued its rhythmic compressions. A man from the crowd, who looked to be an off-duty firefighter by his build and his calm demeanor, knelt beside David, holding the IV bag high. It was a testament to the human spirit, strangers working together to fight for a life. A stark, damning contrast to the uniformed officer just yards away who had actively chosen to impede that fight. The wail of an approaching siren grew steadily louder. It was a welcome sound that nonetheless twisted a knot in Imani's gut. Help was coming, but it was help that should never have been needed. It was help that was arriving minutes too late. 4 minutes later, an eternity in cardiac care, another ambulance from a neighboring district screamed onto the grass. Two new paramedics, a man and a woman Imani vaguely recognized from training sessions, jumped out and rushed to the scene with their own equipment. There was a frantic, hurried exchange of information. David, still bagging the patient, pointed from the monitor to the Lucas machine, and then, his arms shaking with fury, he pointed directly at Imani, locked in the back of the patrol car. The female paramedic's head whipped around, her eyes widening in confusion and then shock as she saw Imani's face pressed against the glass. The look was a mirror of what Imani felt, a deep, professional offense. One of us is in handcuffs while a patient is coding. It was a violation of a sacred trust, an unthinkable breach of interagency protocol. The new crew worked with swift efficiency, taking over from David. They loaded the patient onto their stretcher, a flurry of controlled, expert motion. Imani watched as they lifted him, his body limp, his face partially covered by the oxygen mask. Was he still viable? Was there any rhythm on the monitor other than the flat line she had last seen? The not knowing was a physical torment. As they wheeled the stretcher toward their ambulance, David jogged over to the patrol car. His face was pale, streaked with sweat and righteous anger. He couldn't open the door, but he leaned close to the window, his voice strained. "They're taking him to University General," he said. "We never got a rhythm back, no pulse, nothing. They're working him, but... Imani, it's bad. The delay." His voice trailed off, choked with emotion. The words hit Imani like a physical blow. No pulse. The entire time she was being arrested, the entire time she sat in this car, the patient had remained in asystole. The catastrophe that Jennings's intervention had guaranteed had come to pass. The delay wasn't a theoretical risk anymore. It was measured in the irreversible death of brain cells, in the destruction of a life, in the grief that would soon consume a family. "David, you need to call the chief right now," Imani instructed, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. "You need to document everything. The time Jennings arrived, the time he first interfered, the time of the arrest. Every single second." "Already did," David said, his jaw tight. "He's on his way. The whole world is about to come down on this guy's head." The other ambulance pulled away, its lights flashing, its siren cutting a path through the park. Imani watched it go until it was just a speck in the distance, carrying away the patient she had been forced to abandon. A profound sense of failure washed over her, a bitter, metallic taste in her mouth, even though she knew with every fiber of her being that the failure was not her own. Officer Jennings finally finished his radio call and climbed into the driver's seat. He adjusted his rearview mirror, his eyes briefly meeting hers in the reflection. There was no remorse in his gaze, no uncertainty. There was only a cold, self-satisfied hardness. He had enforced his will, and in his world, that was all that mattered. He started the engine and pulled away from the scene without a word, leaving David standing alone on the grass. The silence in the car was a suffocating blanket. The only sound was the crackle of the police radio, a stream of mundane chatter about traffic stops and noise complaints that felt like it was from another universe. "That man is going to die," Imani said, the words breaking the silence. She needed to say it. She needed him to acknowledge the consequence of his actions, to face the reality of what his ego had wrought. "Because of you. Because you needed to feel important while his brain was dying. I hope it was worth it." Jennings's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel, but he didn't turn. "You should have followed a lawful order," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "This is on you. You resisted." Imani leaned her head back against the hard plastic seat and closed her eyes. It was useless. Arguing with him was like arguing with a brick wall. He was insulated by his badge, by his own unshakable certainty, by a system that had clearly taught him that his authority was absolute. He had already convicted her in his mind to justify his own catastrophic misjudgment. The drive to the precinct's booking station was a journey from one battlefield to another. She had lost the first skirmish on the grass of Liberty Park. She would not lose the war. The booking facility was a place Imani had only ever seen from the other side of the divide. a cold, sterile environment where she had brought intoxicated patients or individuals suffering mental health crises who needed to be medically cleared before being jailed. She had always been treated with professional respect. Now she was being led through the sally port in handcuffs, the heavy steel doors clanging shut behind her, echoing the finality of her situation. Officer Jennings gripped her arm, steering her through the corridors as if she were a common criminal. The air inside was cold, recycled, and smelled faintly of disinfectant and despair. Officers at their desks looked up as they passed, their conversations faltering. Their eyes registered her paramedic uniform first, then the handcuffs, and a wave of confusion and curiosity rippled through the room. A medic in cuffs was not a common sight. Jennings pushed her toward the booking desk, a high counter presided over by a world-weary-looking sergeant, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a salt-and-pepper mustache and a nameplate that read Sergeant Miller. "Got one for booking," Jennings announced, his voice unnecessarily loud, playing to the audience. "Obstruction and resisting." Sergeant Miller looked up from his paperwork, his gaze falling on Imani, then on Jennings. He raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Resisting what? A bad haircut?" He looked back at Imani. "I know you. You're Cole, from Station 4. You brought in that guy who fell off the roof last month. What in God's name is going on, Jennings?" "She refused to follow a lawful order at a scene," Jennings said, puffing out his chest slightly. "Interfered with my investigation." "What investigation?" Miller pressed, his tone sharp. He wasn't buying the tough guy act. "I heard the chatter on the radio. An unresponsive male in Liberty Park. A medical call. What exactly did she obstruct? His arteries from hardening?" The sarcasm was thick, and a few officers within earshot chuckled. Jennings's face flushed a deep, blotchy red. "She refused to provide identification and became belligerent." "Sergeant, I was performing CPR on a man in cardiac arrest," Imani interjected, her voice calm and measured. "I informed the officer I would provide my credentials as soon as the patient was stabilized. His life was the priority." Miller's eyes narrowed, looking from Imani's resolute face to Jennings's defensive one. The veteran sergeant had been on the job for 30 years. He could smell a bad arrest from a mile away, and this one reeked. "You pulled a medic off a coding patient to ask for her driver's license?" he asked Jennings, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous level. "Is that what you're telling me right now?" "I was securing the scene," Jennings insisted, but his voice had lost some of its bluster under the weight of the sergeant's incredulous stare. Miller just shook his head slowly, a look of profound disappointment on his face. He turned to the booking officer. "Process her, and be quick about it. Get her union rep on the phone." He shot a final, withering glare at Jennings. "My office, now!" The booking process was a systematic stripping away of dignity. Imani's fingerprints were taken, the ink smearing on her skin. A mugshot was taken, the flash of the camera capturing her exhausted but defiant expression. She was instructed to remove her personal belongings, her wallet, which contained her driver's license and her paramedic certifications, her phone, her watch. Each item was placed in a clear plastic bag and cataloged with bureaucratic indifference. The irony was suffocating. The very identification Jennings had deemed more important than a man's life was now being handled as evidence of her supposed crime. The young officer handling the booking, a man whose name tag read Patterson, seemed deeply uncomfortable with the entire situation. He handled her credentials with a reverence that bordered on apology. 7 years of service, advanced cardiac life support, pediatric advanced life support, critical care certification, he muttered, reading from her wallet cards as he logged them into the system. He looked up at her, his eyes full of a conflict he couldn't hide. "Ma'am, are the cuffs too tight? Did you sustain any injuries during the arrest?" "I'm fine," Imani replied, her voice flat, devoid of the emotion churning inside her. "But you should ask my patient that question, the one your colleague prevented me from treating." Patterson flinched as if he'd been struck and quickly looked down, focusing on his paperwork. The message had been received loud and clear. Through the glass window of Sergeant Miller's nearby office, Imani could see the muffled but heated exchange taking place. Miller was on his feet, his hands on his hips, leaning over his desk and speaking in a low, controlled fury. Jennings stood rigidly at attention, his face a mask of stone, but the red blush of humiliation was creeping up his neck. He wasn't being praised for his decisive action, he was being eviscerated. The first cracks in his wall of authority were beginning to show. After the paperwork was complete, Officer Patterson led her down a short hallway to a holding cell. The heavy metal door slid open with a groan. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It'll just be until we can get things sorted out." The door slammed shut and the lock engaged with a deafening clang. Imani was alone. The cell was small, cold, and brutally simple. A concrete bench molded into the wall and a stainless steel toilet. The air was stale and smelled of bleach and regret. She sat down, the cold of the bench seeping through her uniform. For the first time since the call had come in hours earlier, the adrenaline began to recede, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a profound sense of violation. She had dedicated her life to helping people, to being the calm in the storm, the skilled hands that could pull a person back from the brink of death. And for doing her job, for doing what was right, she had been locked in a cage. She put her head in her hands, not in despair, but in a quiet, simmering rage. This was more than just one bad cop having a bad day. This was a systemic failure, an organizational culture that could produce an officer like Cade Jennings, so insecure in his authority that he saw a medical expert saving a life as a personal affront, was deeply broken. Time in the holding cell was a thick, syrupy thing that refused to move. Imani measured its passage by the changing shifts of light through the small, high window and the distant, muffled sounds of the station. She heard phones ringing, officers laughing, the routine hum of a world that had not stopped for her injustice. Each minute that passed felt like an accusation, a fresh layer of insult on the injury that had been done to her profession, and to the patient whose face was seared into her mind. She replayed the encounter with Jennings, dissecting every word, every action. Could she have handled it differently? Should she have been more compliant, shown him the ID, and hoped for the best? The answer, every single time, was a resolute and uncompromising no. Compliance would have been a betrayal of her patient. It would have meant conceding that a police officer's demand for paperwork superseded a paramedic's duty to save a life. It was a principle she would not, could not, surrender. But the cost of that principle was this: a cold, concrete bench and the gnawing uncertainty about the fate of the man she had been forced to abandon. She wasn't just a prisoner in a cell, she was a prisoner of her own conscience, haunted by the knowledge that she had been stopped from giving her all. And in that cold, quiet cell, her rage cooled and hardened into something far more dangerous: purpose. This was not an end, it was a beginning. She'd been in the cell for what felt like an eternity, but was probably closer to 90 minutes when she heard footsteps approaching. Not the heavy, purposeful tread of a uniformed officer, but a quicker, more energetic cadence. A man in a tailored charcoal suit stopped in front of her cell door. He was in his late 40s, with a sharp, intelligent face, a neatly trimmed goatee, and eyes that seemed to assess everything in a single, sweeping glance. He carried a worn leather briefcase that looked both expensive and well-used. "Imani Cole?" he asked, his voice calm and confident, a rock in the swirling sea of her chaos. Imani stood up and walked to the bars. "Yes. My name is Marcus Thorne. I'm an attorney with the Paramedics Union," he said. "Your partner David called your supervisor, and your supervisor called me. I came as fast as I could." He offered a small, reassuring smile. "Let's get you out of here." A wave of relief so profound it almost buckled her knees washed over Imani. She wasn't alone anymore. The system she had dedicated her life to, the brotherhood and sisterhood of first responders, was now fighting for her. "Thank you for coming." "Don't thank me yet," Thorne said, already pulling a legal pad and a pen from his briefcase. "I've already spoken with Sergeant Miller. He's..." displeased with his officer's conduct, to put it mildly. But the arrest report has been filed. Officer Jennings is doubling down, claiming you were physically and verbally aggressive. We need to build our case starting right now. I want you to tell me everything that happened from the moment you got the call. Don't leave out a single detail, no matter how small. Imani began her story. With the precision of a trained medical professional reporting a patient's history, she recounted the entire event. The dispatch call, the patient's condition, agonal breathing, cyanosis, no pulse, her immediate start of CPR. Then she described Officer Jennings's arrival, his tone, his posture, his immediate and inexplicable demands. She detailed her repeated attempts to explain the medical urgency, his refusal to listen, his escalation, his physical assault, and the eventual arrest. Thorne listened intently, his pen flying across the page, his expression growing grimmer with every word. He would occasionally interrupt with a sharp, clarifying question. Did he ever state what crime he was investigating? No, just that he needed to secure the scene. Did he ever ask about the patient's condition? Did he show any concern for the man's well-being? None whatsoever. His only concern was establishing his authority and seeing my ID. And you told him where your ID was? I told him it was in the ambulance and he could verify my credentials with my partner or through dispatch, but that I would not stop active treatment of a critical patient. Thorne nodded, a grim satisfaction on his face. That's perfect. You established a clear willingness to comply once the exigent medical circumstance was resolved. His refusal to accept that is key. He looked up from his notes, his sharp eyes meeting hers. Imani, what he did wasn't just a bad judgment call. It was illegal. State law is crystal clear on the issue of interfering with emergency medical personnel. The arrest was unlawful from the moment he laid hands on you. He closed his notepad. They'll release you within the hour. The charges of obstruction and resisting are baseless. They won't even make it to a prosecutor's desk. This is a classic case of what we call contempt of cop, and it's not a real crime. Jennings arrested you because you challenged his authority, not because you broke the law. What about my patient? Imani asked, the question that had been tormenting her for hours, a lead weight in her soul. Do you know anything? Thorne's expression softened, the hard edge of the lawyer replaced by a flicker of human empathy. David gave me an update. He was transported to University General. He never regained a pulse in the field. They were performing CPR on him the entire way. He was alive when they arrived at the ER, but the doctors are saying it's a grim prognosis. The next few hours are critical. He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. The delay in advanced care, it's going to be a major factor in this case. If the worst happens, this goes from being an unlawful arrest to a potential wrongful death suit. The city knows that. They're already in damage control mode. True to Thorne's word, the cell door slid open 40 minutes later. Sergeant Miller was standing there, his expression stern. You're being released on your own recognizance, Cole. The charges are being reviewed, but I don't expect them to stick. He handed Imani the plastic bag containing her belongings. For what it's worth, he said, his voice low, I'm sorry this happened. He was out of line. Imani just nodded, taking her property. The apology was a small concession, but it was something. As she walked out of the station with Marcus Thorne at her side, blinking in the harsh afternoon sun, she felt like she was surfacing after being held underwater. She was free, but she wasn't whole. A part of her was still back in that park, fighting for a life that had been needlessly, criminally endangered. And another part of her was now steeling itself for the bigger fight to come. This wasn't over. It had just begun. David was waiting for her in the parking lot, leaning against the side of their ambulance, which he'd retrieved from its temporary abandonment at the park. His uniform was rumpled, and his face was etched with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. He straightened up as soon as he saw her, rushing forward to pull her into a firm, brotherly hug. Imani, my God, are you okay? He asked, his voice thick with emotion. I've been better, she said, pulling back, the knot in her stomach tightening again. Tell me about the patient. What's the latest? David's face clouded over. He took a deep breath. It's bad, really bad. I stayed at the hospital until they took him up to the ICU. His name is Robert Miller. He's 62. His wife and daughter are there." He hesitated, struggling to find the right words. "They got his heart started again at the hospital, but he was down for too long. The ER doctor said the anoxia, the lack of oxygen to his brain, was profound. They don't know what the neurological outcome will be, but they're preparing the family for the worst. Severe brain damage is almost a certainty." The words landed like stones in her stomach. Every paramedic lives with the fear of losing a patient, of a bad outcome despite their best efforts. But this was different. This wasn't a loss to an unwinnable injury or a disease. This was a loss engineered by a man's ego. Those precious minutes Jennings had stolen from them, while he postured and demanded and finally arrested her, were the minutes Robert Miller's brain was being starved into darkness. The image of Jennings's smug, self-satisfied face flashed in her mind, and her simmering anger ignited into a white-hot flame. "His family?" Imani asked, her voice tight. "Do they know what happened?" "They know," David said grimly. "The bystanders who filmed it stayed and gave statements to the other ambulance crew. They showed the videos to the police supervisor who showed up. The family knows there was an interference." Marcus Thorne, who had been standing back to give them a moment, stepped forward. His expression was grim. "This confirms our path forward," he said, his voice all business now. "The harm is no longer theoretical. We have a direct, documented, and catastrophic consequence of Officer Jennings's actions. We're no longer just talking about your civil rights being violated, Imani. We're talking about a man who may never wake up, or who may wake up as a completely different person, because a police officer couldn't handle being told that a dying man was more important than his authority." They drove to Thorne's office, a sleek, modern space in a downtown high-rise that felt a world away from the grit of the holding cell. For the next 3 hours, Imani gave a formal, recorded statement. Thorne's team was already at work, a whirlwind of focused activity. Paralegals were filing motions, contacting witnesses from the park, and drafting the initial complaint. They had already received sworn affidavits from 3 of the bystanders who had recorded the incident on their phones. Their videos, though shaky, were damning. They clearly showed Imani providing constant, competent medical care. They captured Jennings's aggressive demands, and they recorded the horrific moment he physically pulled her off the patient and cuffed her. "The city's first move will be to try and discredit you," Thorne explained as they reviewed the evidence. "They'll dig into your service record, your personal life, anything they can find to paint you as an unstable, insubordinate hothead. But," he said with a confident smile, "they're going to come up empty. Your service record is impeccable. You have commendations for patient care. You have 0 disciplinary actions against you in 7 years. You are, for lack of a better term, the perfect plaintiff." He pointed to a paragraph in the draft of the lawsuit. "We are filing a federal lawsuit under Section 1983 of the Civil Rights Act. We will argue that Officer Jennings, acting under the color of law, deprived you of your 4th Amendment rights against unlawful seizure and your 14th Amendment right to due process. Furthermore, we are adding a state-level claim for intentional interference with emergency medical care, false arrest, and battery." He looked her directly in the eye, his expression intense. "We will be suing Officer Jennings individually and the city for failure to train and supervise its officers. We are not just going after the soldier. We are going after the army that sent him into battle unprepared." The lawsuit was filed electronically at 9 a.m. the next morning. It was an explosive document, detailing in cold, legal language the horrifying events of the previous day. It named Officer Cade Jennings and the city as defendants and sought unspecified damages for the violation of Imani's civil rights, emotional distress, and the damage to her professional reputation. Within an hour, the media storm began. The story was perfect for the 24-hour news cycle, a narrative so stark and compelling it required no embellishment. A hero paramedic, a black woman, arrested by an overzealous white cop while trying to save a man's life. The witness videos, which had been sent to a local news station by one of the bystanders, went viral. The image of Imani in her blue uniform being forced into the back of a patrol car while her patient lay unattended on the grass was broadcast across the country. It was a visual representation of a system failing in real time. Her phone, which she'd gotten back with her other belongings, began to light up with a ceaseless barrage of calls and texts. Friends, family, and colleagues from across the state reached out, all expressing their shock, their outrage, and their unwavering support. Messages poured in on social media from other paramedics, EMTs, and nurses, each sharing their own stories of being bullied or obstructed by law enforcement. Her arrest had struck a nerve, touching a deep well of resentment among medical first responders who often felt treated as subordinates rather than partners by police. The fire department issued a swift and powerful statement, standing firmly behind Imani. It called her actions heroic and in accordance with the highest standards of patient care, and announced she was being placed on paid administrative leave for her well-being. The police department, in contrast, issued a terse, defensive statement, saying the incident was under internal investigation and that Officer Jennings had been placed on administrative desk duty. The battle lines had been drawn. Imani, with the full backing of her union and Marcus Thorne, stood on one side. On the other stood Officer Jennings and a city bureaucracy that would now go to extraordinary lengths to protect itself and its employee from the consequences of his actions. The lawsuit wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a declaration of war. In the world of high-stakes litigation, the first move from a defendant like a city is often a test of resolve, a way to see if the plaintiff will scare easily. 2 weeks after the lawsuit was filed, Marcus Thorne received a call from the city attorney's office. It was the call he had been expecting. "They want to talk settlement," he told Imani over the phone. "They're trying to gauge how serious we are, see if we'll go away quietly." "What are they offering?" Imani asked, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. Thorne let out a short, humorless laugh. "You should sit down for this. They're offering to pay your legal fees and give you $50,000 for your trouble. They called it a nuisance value settlement." Imani was silent for a moment, processing the sheer, unmitigated audacity of the offer. $50,000. It wasn't a settlement, it was an insult. It was the monetary equivalent of a pat on the head and a "don't let the door hit you on the way out." It was a pittance meant to make the problem disappear before it got too expensive or embarrassing. It was an offer made by people who saw this not as a gross violation of rights and a near-fatal dereliction of duty, but as a public relations inconvenience to be managed. It was an offer that completely ignored the permanent, devastating harm done to Robert Miller and his family. "Tell them no," Imani said, her voice laced with ice. "Tell them I'll see them in court." "That's what I thought you'd say," Thorne replied, a note of pride in his voice. "I already told them their offer was offensive and that our next conversation would be during depositions. This was their gambit. They were hoping you were just looking for a quick payday, that the pressure and public attention would make you fold." He paused. "They misjudged you." They had. The city's lawyers and risk managers had made a critical error. They had mistaken Imani's quiet professionalism for weakness. They didn't understand that her fight was no longer just about her own vindication. It had become about Robert Miller. The news from the hospital had been grim. Robert had survived, but just barely. After a week in a medically induced coma, he had woken up to a nightmare. The doctors confirmed the family's worst fears. The prolonged lack of oxygen had caused a catastrophic, irreversible anoxic brain injury. He could breathe on his own, but he couldn't speak, couldn't move his limbs purposefully, couldn't recognize his own wife. He was trapped inside his own body. His life and the lives of his family had been permanently destroyed because of a 7-minute delay on the grass of a park. His family had retained their own lawyer and were preparing a separate multi-million-dollar lawsuit against the city. The two cases, while legally distinct, were inextricably linked. Every victory for Imani would be a victory for Robert. The city's refusal to take her lawsuit seriously had the opposite effect they intended. Instead of silencing her, it galvanized her. And when news of the insulting settlement offer leaked to the press, a strategic leak from Thorne's office, the story exploded with renewed fury. Editorials were written condemning the city's callousness. National news outlets picked up the story, framing it as a textbook example of police overreach and municipal arrogance. A GoFundMe page started by Imani's fire station to help with any uncovered expenses was flooded with donations from strangers across the country. The hashtag #StandWithCole trended on social media for days. She had become an unwilling symbol for every first responder who had ever been bullied, questioned, or impeded by a law enforcement officer on a power trip. The pressure on the city mounted. The police chief held a disastrous press conference where he was hammered with questions about Officer Jennings's disciplinary record. It was revealed, through leaks from within the department, that Jennings, in his short 5-year career, had accumulated nearly a dozen citizen complaints for excessive force and abuse of authority. None of the complaints had resulted in any significant disciplinary action. He was a lawsuit waiting to happen, a problem the department had ignored until it blew up in their faces on a national stage. For Imani, life had become surreal. She was on paid leave from the job she loved, spending her days in meetings with lawyers instead of responding to 911 calls. She tried to keep a low profile, but her face was everywhere. She'd be recognized at the grocery store, with strangers stopping her to shake her hand and thank her for standing up. The attention was uncomfortable, but it strengthened her resolve. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for all of them. She was fighting for Robert Miller. Marcus Thorne used the intense media scrutiny to his advantage, applying relentless pressure on the city's legal team. "We're moving into the discovery phase," he told her during one of their strategy sessions. "This is where they have to turn over everything they have related to the case. They can't hide anything." The discovery process in a federal lawsuit is a slow, methodical grinding of legal gears. It's a battle fought not in a courtroom, but through a relentless exchange of documents, data, and demands. For months, Thorne's office was inundated with thousands of pages from the city, training manuals, internal affairs reports, policy guidelines, and after a significant fight, Officer Jennings's complete unredacted personnel file. The file was a damning indictment of the department's failure to supervise. It showed a clear pattern of aggressive behavior, of escalating minor confrontations into major incidents. It was filled with citizen complaints that had been summarily dismissed with a note, "Officers' actions found to be within department policy." The policy itself, they discovered, was the problem. It was vague, giving officers immense discretion and implicitly encouraging a mindset of dominance over de-escalation. But all of it, the personnel file, the training manuals, the depositions of other officers, was secondary to the single most important piece of evidence, the one digital file they had been fighting for since day one. The city had resisted turning it over, claiming it was part of an ongoing internal investigation, a standard bureaucratic stonewalling tactic. But Thorne had been relentless, filing motion after motion, until a federal judge finally ordered them to produce it. It arrived on a password-protected hard drive delivered by a court courier, the unedited 30-minute footage from Officer Cade Jennings's body camera. Thorne had it set up in a conference room on a large monitor. Imani sat beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. David was there too for support and to corroborate the sequence of events. The air in the room was thick with anticipation. This was the moment of truth. "Are you ready for this?" Thorne asked her gently. Imani took a deep breath, steeling herself to relive the worst day of her life. She nodded. "Play it." The video began. The unblinking eye of the camera would finally show the world the truth. And that truth, she knew, would be her weapon. The video began with a jarring, unsteady view of the ground as Officer Jennings got out of his patrol car. The audio was crystal clear. The roar of the highway in the distance, the crackle of his radio, the sound of his own heavy, purposeful breathing. Then he began walking toward the scene, the camera's perspective becoming his own, an unnerving first-person view of the confrontation he was about to create. He approached the circle of onlookers, his voice already sharp, preemptively aggressive. "What's going on here? Everybody back up, give me some room. Then the camera centered on her. A version of Imani kneeling on the grass, her back partially to the camera, completely engrossed in her patient. The footage was visceral, immediate. It captured the gray, sweaty pallor of Robert Miller's skin, the shallow, desperate gasps for air he was taking before he arrested. It was obvious to anyone, medically trained or not, that he was in extreme distress. The audio was even more damning than Imani remembered. "Hold on a minute," Jennings's voice commanded, cold and devoid of any empathy. "This is my scene. You don't do anything until I say so." The camera showed her, not even looking up at first, her hands moving with purpose over the patient's chest. Her own voice replied, calm and focused. "I'm a paramedic. This man is in cardiac arrest. I need to start compressions." The footage perfectly corroborated her story. Her attention was and remained on saving a life. "I gave you an order, medic. Stop what you're doing." Jennings's voice repeated, louder this time. The camera tilted up slightly as he stepped closer, looming over the scene, physically asserting his dominance. It captured Imani's quick glance up, the firmness in her voice as she explained the situation. "Officer, I have a man here who is clinically dead. Every second I delay, his chances of survival drop by 10%. I need to work. Now." Watching it now from his perspective was chilling. The camera showed no interest in the patient. Its focus remained fixed on her, the perceived source of defiance. It recorded her clear, concise explanations of the medical emergency and her lawful duty. It recorded her offer to have her credentials verified by other means while she continued her life-saving work. It recorded the moment she dismissed him to instruct David on the Lucas device. Then came the escalation. The camera lurched as Jennings stepped forward to block her. His voice, captured by the microphone inches from his mouth, was a low growl. "You are obstructing my investigation." Her reply was just as clear. "You are obstructing a resuscitation." The most crucial moment was the arrest itself. The video showed, from Jennings's own point of view, his hand reaching out and clamping down on her arm. It showed him yanking her away from the patient. The camera swung wildly, capturing the medical kit spilling across the ground, the frantic look on David's face. Then the view became a chaotic jumble of Imani's back and the sky as Jennings spun her around and forced her arms behind her back. The sharp metallic clicks of the handcuffs were picked up with perfect clarity by the microphone. The video continued for another 20 minutes. It showed the angry shouts of the construction workers. It showed David, his face a mask of desperation, trying to manage the scene alone. It showed the arrival of the second ambulance. And it showed the long, silent walk back to the patrol car, where Imani was placed in the back like a piece of cargo. It recorded everything. When the video ended, the conference room was silent. David was shaking his head, his face pale. Imani felt strangely numb, vindicated but also sickened to her stomach. It was all there. Every lie in Jennings's report, every self-serving statement the city had made, was obliterated by this single, unblinking recording of the truth. Marcus Thorne sat back in his chair, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. He looked at Imani, his eyes alight with a lawyer's righteous fire. "In 25 years of practicing law," he said, his voice quiet with awe, "I have never seen a more powerful or more damning piece of evidence. That camera didn't just record an unlawful arrest, it recorded a man's soul. It recorded his arrogance, his insecurity, and his utter disregard for human life." He stood up and began to pace the room, energized, his mind already 5 steps ahead. "This changes everything. Their entire strategy was to paint you as the aggressor, as uncooperative and belligerent. This video proves you were the only person in that interaction who remained calm, professional, and focused on the job at hand. Jennings wasn't a cop maintaining order. He was a bully who couldn't handle a woman telling him she had more important things to do than stroke his ego." Thorne stopped pacing and looked at the blank screen. "The city's lawyers will see this footage, and they will know their case is unwinnable. They'll come back to the table with a real settlement offer, a big one." He turned to Imani, his eyes glinting. But that's not what we're going to do. We're going to show this video to a jury. We're going to let 12 ordinary citizens see what Officer Cade Jennings did in that park. We're going to depose him, make him watch it, and make him explain every single second of it under oath. This case is no longer about getting you a settlement, Imani. It's about getting you justice, the kind of justice that changes laws. A deposition is not a trial. There is no judge, no jury. It takes place in the sterile, air-conditioned confines of a law firm's conference room. But in many ways, it is more grueling. It is a slow, methodical dissection of a witness's story, a legal marathon designed to lock them into a version of events they cannot later change, and to expose every weakness, every contradiction, every lie. Officer Cade Jennings walked into the deposition room flanked by 2 attorneys from the city. He wore his full-dress uniform, crisp and pressed, his posture ramrod straight. He carried himself with the same air of unshakable confidence he'd had in the park. He was there to defend his actions, to project the image of a decisive officer who had been forced to take control of a chaotic scene from an uncooperative paramedic. He believed his badge and his version of the story would protect him. He was profoundly, devastatingly wrong. For the first hour, the city's attorney led Jennings through his own testimony, allowing him to construct his narrative. He described arriving at a disorderly scene, his attempts to secure the area, and paramedic Cole's immediate and hostile refusal to comply with his lawful orders. He painted a picture of himself as the calm center of a storm, a professional doing his job in the face of insubordination. Then it was Marcus Thorne's turn. Thorne began calmly, his questions simple and direct. "Officer Jennings, you've been with the department for 5 years, is that correct?" "Yes, sir." "And in that time, have you received training on interacting with other first responders at emergency scenes?" "Yes, sir. We receive extensive training on interagency cooperation." "And does that training instruct you that the immediate life-saving care of a patient is the top priority at a medical emergency?" Jennings shifted in his seat. "My priority is to secure the scene for the safety of all personnel and to investigate any potential criminal activity." "That wasn't my question, officer," Thorne said, his voice still mild. "Does your training instruct you that a paramedic's active treatment of a patient in cardiac arrest takes precedence over administrative requests, like asking for identification?" The city's attorney objected, but Thorne just smiled. "Let me rephrase. At any point did you believe the patient, Mr. Miller, was not in serious medical distress?" "I am not a medical professional," Jennings said stiffly. "I could not make that assessment." "Exactly," Thorne pounced, his voice sharpening. "You are not a medical professional, yet you felt qualified to order the actual medical professional on scene to stop providing life-saving care. Is that correct?" "I ordered her to step back so I could secure the scene." Thorne nodded slowly, then turned to his paralegal. "Please play the first video exhibit. Body camera footage of Officer Jennings, timestamp 9:15:22. The large monitor at the end of the conference table flickered to life. The deposition room was filled with the sounds of the park, and the video began. Thorne had Jennings watch the first 2 minutes, showing his arrival and his initial aggressive demands. "Officer," Thorne said, pausing the video just after Jennings had yelled, "I said step away now." At this point, you had been on scene for less than 30 seconds. You had not spoken to any witnesses. You had not assessed any potential threats. Yet you decided the most important action you could take was to stop the paramedic from treating her patient. Why? "I was establishing control of the scene," Jennings repeated, the phrase his mantra, his shield. "Control over what exactly? A woman on her knees trying to save a man's life?" Carter let the question hang in the air before playing the next segment, the one where Imani calmly explained the patient's condition. He paused it again. "Officer, on this video, we can hear paramedic Cole, a 7-year veteran with an exemplary record, telling you the patient is in cardiac arrest. You understood that to be a life-threatening condition, did you not?" "I understood it was a medical situation," Jennings hedged. And yet your response was not to ask how you could help. It was not to clear the area for her. It was to demand her identification. Is that right? It is standard procedure to identify all parties on a scene. Is it standard procedure to arrest a paramedic for prioritizing her dying patient over your request for her driver's license? Thorne's voice was rising now, losing its gentle tone and taking on a hard prosecutorial edge. For the next 4 hours, Thorne dismantled Jennings's story piece by piece, using the officer's own camera footage as the wrecking ball. He forced Jennings to watch himself yank Imani away from the patient. "Please describe for the record what is happening in this video, officer." Jennings stared at the screen, his face pale, a sheen of sweat on his brow. I am effecting an arrest. You are physically assaulting a licensed paramedic and preventing her from rendering aid," Thorne corrected him. "Did you see the medical kit spill onto the ground? Did you see the patient, Mr. Miller, lying there unattended while you focused on handcuffing Miss Cole?" By the end of the deposition, Cade Jennings was a changed man. His arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a sullen, defensive silence. His carefully constructed narrative of a hero cop had been exposed as a self-serving fantasy. The official transcript would show him to be evasive, argumentative, and ultimately unable to provide a single credible justification for his actions. He had walked into the room a confident officer of the law. He walked out a man who knew his career was over. The city's attorneys knew it too. Their faces were grim. They had built their entire defense around the testimony of their officer, and Thorne had just reduced that testimony to rubble. The unblinking eye of the camera, combined with Thorne's relentless questioning, had left them with nothing. Their star witness had just become their biggest liability. The day after the deposition, Marcus Thorne's phone rang. It was the lead counsel for the city. The tone was no longer dismissive or condescending. It was the sound of utter defeat. "They want to settle," Thorne told Imani later that day in his office. He looked calm, but she could see a triumphant gleam in his eyes. "They know the deposition was a disaster. They know what that body camera footage will do to a jury. They're no longer talking about nuisance value." He slid a single sheet of paper across the polished mahogany desk. On it was a number, written in blue ink. $8,500,000. Imani stared at the figure. It was an incredible amount of money, a life-changing sum. It was an admission of guilt, a clear signal that the city knew it had no legal leg to stand on. Her annual salary was around $70,000. This was more than 100 times that. It was enough to pay off her mortgage, set up college funds for her future children, support her parents, and live without financial worry for the rest of her life. It was everything the city had said her ordeal wasn't worth, and then some. Part of her, the tired part that had been living this nightmare for months, wanted to scream, yes! She wanted it to be over. She wanted to stop the endless meetings, the media attention, the gnawing anxiety of the impending trial. She wanted to go back to her life, to her ambulance, to the simple, profound work of saving people. She wanted to disappear from the headlines and just be Imani Cole again. "What do you think?" she asked Thorne, her voice quiet. Thorne leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. He looked at her not as a lawyer advising a client, but as a man assessing a fellow fighter. "From a purely financial perspective, it's a very strong offer," he said, his voice measured. "We could probably push them higher, maybe to 10 million, but this is in the ballpark of a major victory without the risk and stress of a trial. If you take this, you walk away with complete financial security. We can get them to expunge the arrest record as part of the deal. No one would blame you for a second for taking it." He paused, his gaze steady and piercing. "But you didn't come to me for a purely financial perspective. You came to me for justice." Justice. The word hung in the air between them. Was this justice? A check and a quiet end to the affair? Officer Jennings would likely be fired as a scapegoat, but the system that created him, the policies that enabled him, the culture of impunity that protected him, all of that would remain unchanged. The next Cade Jennings in another city on another sunny morning could do the very same thing to another paramedic. The money would fix her problems, but it wouldn't fix the problem. She thought about Robert Miller, lying unresponsive in a long-term care facility, his family's lives shattered. She thought about the dozens of messages of support she'd received from EMTs and paramedics across the country, stories of their own run-ins with police, of being bullied, threatened, and treated like subordinates instead of partners. She thought of the low-grade fear they all felt, the worry that doing their job correctly could cost them their own freedom. This wasn't just her fight anymore. The viral videos, the media attention, the disastrous deposition, it had all turned her case into something bigger. It had become a test case, a potential landmark for the rights of all first responders. This offer comes with a non-disclosure agreement, doesn't it? Imani asked, already knowing the answer. Thorne nodded. Of course. A bulletproof, ironclad NDA. They want your silence. They'll pay a premium for it. They want to make sure that body camera footage is never shown in a public court, that Jennings's deposition transcript is never released. That was the deal breaker. They wanted to buy her story, to bury the truth she had fought so hard to bring to light. They wanted to pay her to pretend this never happened. No, Imani said, the single word firm and clear. The doubt that had been clouding her mind vanished, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. No deal. A slow smile spread across Marcus Thorne's face. It was the answer he had been hoping for. I thought you might say that. This isn't about the money, Marcus, Imani continued, leaning forward, her eyes flashing with a fire he hadn't seen before. It was never just about the money. This is about making sure that no paramedic, no EMT, no firefighter ever has to hesitate to treat a patient because they're afraid of the police officer standing over their shoulder. I want that body camera footage shown in court. I want Jennings to have to answer for what he did in front of a jury of our peers. And I want a verdict that sends a message not just to this city, but to every police department in this country. You do not interfere with medical personnel who are saving a life. Period. Her stand was a declaration. She was turning down a fortune for a principle. She was choosing the uncertainty and agony of a public trial over the comfort and security of a private settlement. It was a choice that would require immense courage. But for Imani, it was the only choice she could live with. She had fought for her patient in the park, and now she would fight for every patient and every paramedic in a court of law. The city thought they could buy her off. They were about to learn that her integrity was not for sale. With settlement talks officially dead, the machinery of the federal court system ground toward a trial date. The weeks leading up to it were a blur of intense preparation for Imani. Marcus Thorne and his team put her through mock cross-examinations, peppering her with the most aggressive, accusatory questions the city's lawyers could possibly devise. They wanted to prepare her for the stress of the witness stand, to ensure that her composure, which had been so powerful on the body cam footage, would hold under the withering pressure of a courtroom. The trial was not just a legal proceeding, it was a form of theater, and the first act was jury selection. This was where the tone of the entire trial would be set. It was a painstaking process of questioning a pool of ordinary citizens to uncover biases, both conscious and unconscious, that could influence their judgment. Imani sat at the plaintiff's table beside Marcus Thorne, watching as dozens of potential jurors were brought into the stately wood-paneled courtroom. They were a cross-section of the community: teachers, retirees, mechanics, small business owners. 12 of them would be chosen to decide her fate. The city's legal team, led by a sharp, immaculately dressed man named Jonathan Crane, was looking for a specific type of juror. They wanted people who were instinctively pro-law enforcement, people who believed that questioning a police officer was inherently wrong. They asked questions like, do you believe it is a citizen's duty to comply with any order given by a police officer without question? And, do you have any family members who have had a negative experience with law enforcement? Marcus Thorne's approach was the opposite. He was searching for empathy. He was looking for people who could understand the concept of conflicting duties, people who trusted medical professionals, and people who were skeptical of unchecked authority. His questions were more nuanced. Imagine a situation where a firefighter tells you to evacuate a building because it's on fire, but a police officer tells you to stay put for an investigation. In that moment of conflict, whose expertise would you be more inclined to trust regarding the immediate threat to your life? One potential juror, a stern-looking man who worked in logistics, answered without hesitation. You trust the expert in the relevant field. The firefighter knows fire. The cop knows the law. You don't ask a lawyer to put out a fire. Thorne made a small, satisfied check mark on his notepad. The process took 2 full days. Slowly, methodically, the pool was whittled down. By the end of the second day, they had their jury, 12 citizens and 2 alternates. It was a diverse group. The logistics manager had made it. So had a registered nurse, a high school science teacher, a stay-at-home mother, and a young software engineer. Thorne was pleased. It was not a jury that was inherently anti-police, but it was a jury of thoughtful, independent thinkers. They were people who respected authority but were not blinded by it. They were people who would be able to watch that body camera footage and see not an officer and a civilian, but 2 public servants with competing duties, and judge which duty was more important. As they left the courthouse that evening, the reality of the situation finally hit Imani with its full weight. The next morning, the trial would begin. Her life, her reputation, and a cause that had become bigger than herself would be placed in the hands of those 12 strangers. "How are you feeling?" Thorne asked, sensing her anxiety. "Like I'm about to run the most important call of my life," Imani admitted, her voice barely a whisper. Thorne stopped and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You've been preparing for this your whole life, Imani. Not in law books, but in the back of an ambulance, in every crisis you've ever managed. All you have to do tomorrow is the same thing you did in that park. Stay calm, be professional, and tell the truth. The truth is all we need." The trial began not with Imani, but with the family of Robert Miller. Thorne knew that before the jury could understand the crime against Imani, they had to understand the stakes. They had to see the human cost of Officer Jennings's actions. Robert's wife, a quiet, dignified woman named Sarah, took the stand. Through tears, she described the man her husband was, a vibrant, loving grandfather who ran his own carpentry business, and the man he was now, a shell of his former self, confined to a bed, unable to communicate, kept alive by machines. The ER doctor who treated Robert took the stand next, explaining in precise, clinical detail how the delay in advanced medical care, caused by the interference at the scene, had directly contributed to the severity of the catastrophic brain injury. With each witness, Thorne was building a wall of evidence around Officer Jennings, brick by brick. He was showing the jury the full context of the situation, the tragic ripple effect of one man's bad decision. By the time court adjourned for the day, the atmosphere in the room had shifted palpably. The jurors were no longer just passive observers. They were invested. They had heard from the victim's family and the doctor. They had heard the story from every angle except 2, Imani's and Officer Jennings's. The stage was set for the main event. The next day, the jury would finally see the video. The energy in the courtroom was electric on the 4th day of the trial. This was the day the jury would see what happened for themselves. Marcus Thorne began the morning by calling his final witness to the stand, Imani Cole. Imani walked to the stand with a quiet confidence. She looked professional and composed in a simple dark blue suit. For an hour, Thorne led her through her story, her training, and the events in the park. Her testimony was clear, concise, and devoid of melodrama. She spoke not as a victim, but as a professional explaining a catastrophic failure in interagency cooperation. She described the medical situation in detail, explaining to the jury what cardiac arrest meant and why every second was critical. Then, Thorne walked to the large screen set up in front of the jury box. "Your Honor, the plaintiff would now like to play the body camera footage of Officer Cade Jennings." The lights in the courtroom were dimmed slightly. The room fell silent as the video began to play. For the next 10 minutes, the jury was transported to the side of that park fountain. They saw the scene not from a distance, but through the eyes of the man who caused the crisis. They saw Imani's focused professionalism. They saw Robert Miller's gray, dying face. They heard Jennings's aggressive demands and Imani's calm, firm refusals. They heard her literally pleading for her patient's life. And then they saw it. They saw Jennings, from his own point of view, lunge forward and grab Imani. They saw him yank her away from her patient. They saw him spin her around and force her arms behind her back. The sharp, metallic clicks of the handcuffs echoed through the silent courtroom. Several jurors flinched. One woman put her hand over her mouth in shock. A man on the back row shook his head in disgust. They weren't just hearing about the arrest anymore. They were witnessing an assault. When the video ended and the lights came up, the impact was visceral. The footage had transformed the case. It was no longer a matter of he said, she said. It was a matter of objective, undeniable reality. The city's attorney, Jonathan Crane, knew he was in deep trouble. His cross-examination of Imani was tentative and ineffective. He tried to portray her as insubordinate, but the video had already refuted that. "Ms. Cole," Crane began, "you'd agree that when a police officer gives you an order, you should follow it." "I agree that I should follow a lawful order," Imani corrected him gently. "An order that forces me to abandon a dying patient in violation of my medical oath and state law is not a lawful order." Crane had no effective rebuttal. Imani's testimony, backed by the irrefutable video, was a fortress. After Imani stepped down, the defense had no choice but to call their only witness, Officer Cade Jennings. He walked to the stand, his face a grim mask. He knew what was coming. Crane led him through his testimony, but it was a hollow exercise. Everyone in the room had already seen the truth. His claims of a chaotic scene and a belligerent paramedic sounded absurd after watching the video. Then it was Thorne's turn for cross-examination. He approached the witness stand, not with anger, but with a quiet, surgical precision. "Officer Jennings," he began, "we've all seen the footage from your body camera. We saw you arrest a paramedic while she was actively treating a man in cardiac arrest. I have only one question for you. Watching that video today, knowing that Mr. Miller suffered a catastrophic brain injury because of the delay you caused, is there anything you would have done differently?" It was a lifeline, a chance for Jennings to show some remorse, some humanity. He could have said, "In hindsight, I should have waited." He could have said, "I misjudged the situation." He could have said anything to show the jury he understood the gravity of his mistake. But he didn't. His pride, the same brittle pride that had caused this disaster, would not let him. "No," Jennings said, his voice defiant. "I stand by my actions. I was following my training to secure the scene." Thorne let the answer hang in the air, a stunning admission of unrepentant arrogance. He walked back to the plaintiff's table. "No further questions, Your Honor." It was a mic drop moment. In that single, defiant answer, Cade Jennings had sealed his own fate and the fate of the city he worked for. He had looked the jury in the eye and told them that, given the chance, he would do it all again. The closing arguments were brief. The city's attorney argued that Jennings made a mistake in a high-stress environment. Then Marcus Thorne rose. He spoke with a quiet, righteous anger. He held up a pair of handcuffs. "Officer Jennings had a choice," he said. "He could have chosen to help. He could have chosen to be a partner. Instead, he chose this. He chose his ego over a man's life. Your verdict today will send a message about what we value as a society. Do we value blind obedience over professional duty? Do we value a badge over a human life? Send a message that the answer is no." The jury filed out. The wait began. Less than 2 hours later, they were back. The foreman, the logistics manager, handed a slip of paper to the clerk. "In the matter of Cole versus Jennings and the city," the clerk began, her voice echoing in the silent room, "on the claim of unlawful seizure in violation of the Fourth Amendment, we, the jury, find for the plaintiff, Imani Cole." A gasp went through the courtroom. On the claim of false arrest, we find for the plaintiff, Imani Cole. Imani squeezed her eyes shut, tears streaming down her face. "We will now read the damages," the clerk continued. "For compensatory damages, including emotional distress and reputational harm, we award the plaintiff $1.9 million. The number was staggering, but the foreman wasn't finished. "And for punitive damages, to be levied against Officer Cade Jennings and the city for its willful and reckless disregard for the plaintiff's constitutional rights, we award the plaintiff $18 million. The courtroom erupted. $19.9 million. It was a thunderous verdict, a number so large it was clearly meant not just to compensate, but to punish and to send a message. The jury hadn't just sided with Imani. They had adopted her outrage. It was a message so loud and clear it would be heard in every police precinct and city hall in America. Imani sobbed, not for the money, but for the overwhelming cleansing sense of vindication. Justice had been done. In the quiet moments after a storm, reflection offers a clarity that the chaos itself can never provide. Looking back, it's possible to see the intricate web of choices and circumstances that led to that sun-drenched confrontation in the park. What drove Officer Cade Jennings? It likely wasn't simple malice, but something more insidious. A deep-seated insecurity masked by a rigid, aggressive interpretation of authority. Perhaps he came from a background where strength was equated with control, and any challenge, especially from a competent, confident black woman in a position of expertise, was perceived not as a difference of professional opinion, but as a direct threat to his identity. He had been trained to see the world as a series of threats to be neutralized, and in his mind, Imani's refusal to comply made her just another threat. If his training had emphasized de-escalation and interagency respect as much as it emphasized officer safety and absolute control, he might have become Imani's greatest ally on that patch of grass instead of her worst obstacle. And what of Imani? If she had been less confident, less forged by the pressures of her past, would she have backed down? If she hadn't possessed that core of steel, perhaps she would have made the easy choice to show her ID, gambling with a stranger's life to avoid a confrontation. The victory was born not just from the injustice of the moment, but from a lifetime of preparation that had unknowingly armed her for that specific fight. Her refusal was not an act of spontaneous defiance, but the logical conclusion of a career spent prioritizing life above all else. This story is a testament to the fact that one person's unwavering commitment to their duty can expose and correct a systemic flaw, creating a legacy of safety and respect for thousands who follow. What do you think is the most important lesson from Imani's story? Have you ever witnessed a situation where someone had to choose between doing what was easy and doing what was right? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and please support our channel so we can continue to bring you these important stories.